Good afternoon and welcome everyone. Welcome to another episode of Whiskey Makes Me Happy Hour. This is our 8th episode in what I think is week 342 of lockdown, if I'm not mistaken. I think I may have lost count of exactly what week this is in lockdown. Starting to feel very much like Groundhog Day. I'm Mark Pendlebury. I'm from WhiskyBrother, and thank you very much for tuning in and joining us again. As always, I hope it's a good excuse for a digital dram and some semblance of normalcy during these crazy times. Let me know where you're from. It's always brilliant to see everyone in the comments, so thank you so much. Say hi. I'm maybe at the end of the show I'll greet a few of you individually, but let me know what's in your glass. Let me know what you're drinking. Based on who our guest is today, I hope there's some bourbon and some rye in your glass, and I hope that's from a particular producer, and we'll get all into that. I hope wherever you're watching from, you're safe and sane. And yeah, before we go kind of any further into the guts of the show and why you're actually here, just a few kind of quick housekeeping items. I keep saying I'll do news next week, and the same goes this week. I will probably do news next week. I will commit to that. We'll take the first maybe 5-10 minutes of next week's episode, and we'll kind of just go over some of the news. At the moment, it's a bit depressing doing the news because these products are being announced, and there aren't that many of them, but the ones that are announced are months away from coming to South Africa, just based on the current situation. And then, so we'll take the snippet. We'll take the first 5-10 minutes of next week's episode and do news. Having said that, there will be an episode next week, and there will be an episode the week after that. We have 2 great guests lined up for the coming 2 weeks. So kind of a heads up, if you hang around till the end, I'll maybe drop some names as to who we are expecting to join us in the coming 2 weeks. As you will have seen, there are plenty of online events happening at the moment. WhiskyBrother, we're obviously doing this one. I'd like to think I haven't seen many other South African kind of live streams, at least not whiskey live streams. So a proudly South African first, I suppose. But if you're paying attention online, there are plenty happening. And actually next week is Vigil, which is the Isla Festival of Malt and Music in Scotland. And although the event itself has been cancelled and there's no physical kind of celebrations happening, there are virtual and online events happening. So I say this because on the WhiskyBrother website, we've actually just put a link there under tastings, under events, and we've tried to kind of create a bit of a consolidated view of some of these events going on. So just to try and make it a bit easier, because the truth is, unless you're getting every email from every newsletter, or you're online, whatever is Twitter or Facebook or Instagram, and you're paying a lot of attention to the accounts, it's hard to miss the events. And there's some really cool events out there. So if you go to whiskeybrother.com, on the top on the navigation, there's an events option. That's where we would usually be listing all our whiskey tastings. But as is obvious, those are all postponed and cancelled for now. Instead, there's a page there of all the online events happening. If we've missed something, please drop us an email and we'll add it. And it will keep adding to it as kind of days and weeks pass. Next week is Vigil, so keep an eye out for that. I know so far Kilhoman, Bowmore, who else is there? Brooklady, they're all having open days. Ardbeg, of course. So it's a great opportunity to tune in and kind of share a whiskey with the fellow community and hear from the individuals that make the whiskey and what news is coming out of those distilleries. Excuse me. So check out that link on our homepage. Hopefully it's a bit helpful. With that in mind as well, we've been a bit creative, as you know, from level 3, which kicks in level 3 South African lockdown, which kicks in hopefully by the end of next week, we expect, Friday. Limited alcohol retailing can finally happen. It goes without saying we are desperately waiting and eager and anxious to get back to work and do what we do and get whiskey into your hand and into your glass. So from our current understanding, at level 3, the shop will be open Monday to Wednesdays in the morning. All those exact details will be shared as the government makes it clear as to what we can and cannot do. At the moment, there's some high-level understanding of what can happen, but we don't have all the nitty-gritty yet. As soon as we do, we'll share it. Check our homepage, check our website, check us out online, and we'll share that as soon as we know. With that being said, and it's absolutely fantastic, and we're really excited to be able to go back to doing what we love doing. The truth is, it's very limited, it's very restrictive, so there are going to be some challenges, but we'll manage those. But the truth is, the bar will not be able to operate for several weeks, if not a few months, and that's very likely at this point in time. So with that in mind, we can't do tastings, we can't kind of do group events and share our passion and share our whiskey with people. So we created what we were calling kind of time online with WhiskyBrother. That's the link I've just put there on the Crowdcast platform. The idea here is that you can kind of purchase some time with us. You arrange a tasting online with some of your friends. I think it's also there's a good chance that we're all missing kind of sharing our passion and sharing whiskey. I know there's probably plenty of clubs out there that are doing little Zoom sessions and Google Hangouts with their whiskey friends. And so the thinking is that you can have us join your session. We'll either then lead the tasting, or we'll just kind of sit back in the background and throw out some facts and just add to the conversation. Alternatively, if you want to set up like a mini whiskey class about a particular style of whiskey or particular topic, then we'd be more than happy to run those for you. Even to a point if you just you're planning a trip to Scotland and you want to pick our brain as to kind of where best to go and what to see and which distilleries and bars are good. We're fortunate that we get there often, and we'd be more than happy to kind of share that information with you. So it's just a way of trying to support the bar while the bar is closed, just to make sure that we can keep looking after the staff, and we can make sure that when the time is right, we can reopen the doors and pick up where we left off. So if anything, it's just a very nice way of showing support to us. But we like to think it's we're adding to your kind of whiskey knowledge and circles and events and clubs by doing some online events with you. So we'll see if it's appealing to anyone. It'd be really cool though and fun to be able to do that. So keep us in mind if you are planning some online events. Check out the link. There's a little bit more detail there about what it does and doesn't include. Sadly, it doesn't include any whiskey. As much as we'd like to, it doesn't include any whiskey. The truth is, as soon as we can, and it's safe to do so, we will start the tastings in person again. So that's very much kind of just a few things I wanted to cover before going into our guest this afternoon and the brands and the whiskies that our guest is involved with. Maybe before I do that, I'm gonna if you'll join me, I'm gonna just say cheers and sláinte mhath. I'm gonna clear that frog in my throat. So what's in my glass? I've got a pour of Rock Hill Farms bourbon. This is a single barrel bourbon, quite hard to come by these days. And if you kind of know a bit, this is actually produced at the Buffalo Trace Distillery. So it seemed a fitting dram to pour. Lovely stuff. Single barrel, 50% alcohol. Cheers everyone. And thanks for tuning in. Thanks for coming back. Suckers. No. So moving then on to why you're actually here, because it definitely is not for me, is our very special guest for this afternoon, Drew Mayville. Very excited to speak to Drew. Drew works for Sazerac company and primarily for at the Buffalo Trace Distillery. So there's kind of a few entities here. So just before I bring Drew up for a few minutes, just wanted to cover some high level, maybe facts or information so that you have a better understanding of where Drew fits in his role within this company and this portfolio. As is very common, most distilleries are not independently owned or privately owned. They're usually part of a slightly larger corporation, in some cases massively large corporations and companies. Here the company in question is Sazerac. Sazerac is interesting in that it's still a privately held American company. Their focus is on alcoholic beverages, so they are drinks producers. Wonderful history dating back to 1850s, 1860s. So that's an impressive period of time. And interesting enough, the original founder of Sazerac was an individual called Thomas Handy. I'm not going to talk about Thomas at all, Mr. Handy. But what's interesting is if you know your bourbons and you're aware of the Buffalo Trace Antique Collection, you'll know that name Thomas H. Handy. There is a whiskey that is part of the Antique Collection released in limited releases every year, and it's the Thomas H. Handy. And so lovely to see kind of that connection between new bourbons being released and the founder of Sazerac going back to 1850, 1860. Sazerac is one of the two largest spirits companies in the US. So, if you kind of in the business, it is a name you know. They have quite a large portfolio of spirits and brands. And as far as I know, and I'm very keen to ask our special guest about the details of this, but Sazerac owns 6 USA distilleries. So there's 6 distilleries in the United States that are owned by Sazerac. I don't think they're all making whiskey. Some of them are, some of them are not. They're making other spirits. And they have 1 distillery in Canada now as well. Interestingly enough, Drew Mayville, our guest this afternoon, is originally Canadian. He's originally from Canada. I believe he's still Canadian. I'm going to ask him about that. But he has been with Sazerac for, I think it's close to 16 years now. And he is the master blender and the director of quality. So a large portfolio, big role, lots of responsibilities, involved with dozens of products and brands and whiskies. And so I think a really interesting individual to speak to. Before joining Sazerac, Drew was with a company called Seagram's for 22 years. So I think all in all, Drew is looking at approximately now 40 years or so in the whiskey space and the alcoholic drinks space. So just in terms of wealth of knowledge and experience, almost unrivaled. At the moment, very much focused on Buffalo Trace. We'll understand a little bit more about that. But Buffalo Trace, I think, will be more of a focus of our discussions today with Drew. Buffalo Trace is without doubt one of my favorite distilleries. And I'm not just saying that for the sake of this. And the truth is, we're in a fortunate position. When I'm organizing the live streams, I can kind of go through, who am I really interested in speaking to? And Buffalo Trace is a brilliant distillery. Love the whiskeys, the bourbons and ryes coming from Buffalo Trace. And so, when the opportunity kind of, arose that we could potentially speak to Drew, it was an absolutely, yes, let's do that. We're fortunate in South Africa, and then we do get a fair amount of the Buffalo Trace products. So for today, I hope you have some BT whiskey on hand. You're looking at things like the standard Buffalo Trace bourbon, which is the namesake release, available in South Africa. Eagle Rare, Blanton's. I've got a bottle of Blanton's here, a fresh bottle for later. This is without doubt my favorite drinking bourbon that is generally available as a standard release. Eagle Rare, there's a few other products that sometimes we get, sometimes we don't get, things like E.H. Taylor, obviously the Sazerac rye, which is available in South Africa. So, it's lovely that we have someone on joining us for a great conversation with products that are actually available in South Africa. So kudos to both Buffalo Trace and the local agent and importer, which is Truman and Orange. And they helped set this up as well. So thank you to them. In terms of Buffalo Trace is actually claimed to be the oldest continuously operating distillery in the United States, which is an impressive feat. There is record of distillation on that site going back to 1775. I almost want to say that again. There's record of distillation on the same site as the distillery dating back to 1775. Now, if you, depending on your point of view, and I think a lot of Scotch whiskey enthusiasts almost incorrectly have this point of view, that bourbon is kind of new or doesn't have the same history or the same provenance, and yet Buffalo Trace has been distilling for, that's 200 plus years. And if you kind of, that predates a lot of the single malt Scotch distilleries that we know and hold so dear today. So, again, brilliant history there. And produces an array of products, and that includes, although there's all those bourbons and ryes that I mentioned, which are brilliant, and we'll be talking to Drew about those. They also release on an annual basis the Buffalo Trace and Tea Collection, which is a annual limited release of 5 different whiskies. They are incredibly sought after. They are considered generally by the whiskey community as some of the best bourbons being produced and released. And the distillery also produces the Van Winkle releases. I say Van Winkle releases because there's 2 general lines there. There's the old Rip Van Winkle, and then there is the Pappy Van Winkles. Last week we actually mentioned the Pappies as well. So a distillery with absolutely amazing history, stunning world-class products coming out that we all love to drink. If you're a bourbon or rye fan, you'll know them. I'm hoping, based on the South African, general whiskey drinker, there sometimes isn't that almost affinity for bourbon. I know we've got some wonderful bourbon kind of followers and fans, and we do our best as a retailer, as a bar, to have some cool bourbons available, some cool ryes available. We can only do so much, to be honest, but I'd like to think, usually under normal operating circumstances, whenever you come back to visit us, we may have another bourbon or rye. And I'm hoping maybe this kicks off and sparks off, more of a Buffalo Trace following, which will then in time allow us to get more antique collections, maybe try and get the E.H. Taylors here, maybe the Stag Juniors, and maybe even get Drew down to South Africa for the whiskey show that we have, for some bottle signings, whatever it may be. So without further ado, I'm going to see if I can find Drew. There he is. I'm inviting him up on screen. As you know from previous live streams, this often takes a few minutes to get right. I did do a technical test with Drew yesterday. Overall, I'd say it worked okay, but maybe at times the connection was slightly intermittent. I'm definitely going to go ahead and blame South African connection. Surely it can't be the American connection. So let's just hope today it goes well. I also, and I said this to Drew, and you will have known this or seen this from either interacting with me at the bar or the shop or the show, or just here online. I generally speak quite fast. When I get excited, I speak even quicker. And so for the sake of Drew and maybe I want to say the language barrier, but the accent difficult barrier. Slow it down. Good afternoon, Drew.
Good afternoon. Actually, morning here.
Of course. Good morning, Drew. How are you?
Well, we're great. I was just tasting some rum.
Oh, well, I guess sorry to hear that, but as long as you enjoyed it.
Yes, it was very good. But we do have some bourbon to taste. We have some Thomas Handy on the table for the antique collection that we need to start formulating for the fall.
Brilliant. That's very exciting. I look forward to you telling us more about that.
No worries.
I just want to check. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, ever since I used the earphones, it's fine.
Okay. Well, having said that, I have an echo. I wonder, shall we quickly try without the headphones?
Sure.
Thank you. Sorry.
Is that better? Can you hear me now?
Yeah. Still, unfortunately. Maybe let's just go ahead with the
Okay.
All right. Let's hopefully that. Oh, no, it has not.
It worked yesterday.
It did, yes. Shall I, if you don't mind, I'm going to just connect you and invite you back online, and then hopefully that will clear it up.
Okay.
Thank you. Apologies, everyone. This is obviously bound to happen. It's never just seamless, but hopefully we can get rid of it. This did happen yesterday, and Drew was very polite in putting in his headphones. That seemed to clear it up. I'm a little bit worried that this is not. If so, I'll ask a question and just let him talk to us for several minutes and keep my question short and punchy, so that you don't have to hear an echo. Let's see how that goes. No. All right. So Drew, anyway, thank you very much for joining me. What I'm going to do is I'm going to mute you while I ask a question, and then I will unmute you and mute myself while you answer that, just to avoid the rather strong echo.
Okay.
All right. So thank you. I hope you heard some of the introduction. Very big fans of both Buffalo Trace and yourself, and very honored and excited to have you on the show. So thank you very much for giving up your time and joining us. Bourbon lovers and rye lovers down here in the southern tip of Africa.
Great.
So I think I'd love to just start then in talking about your daily role. As the master blender for the whole of Sazerac company, I'd love to know kind of what a daily role looks like. Let's just say your weekly roles and responsibilities. and what you're required to do.
Yeah, so my job is probably the best job on the planet. I am very fortunate to be the master blender for Sazerac, which is a global company where we have distilleries all over the world. And I happen to be involved with most of those distilleries. So my daily routine is pretty simple. It's taste all these different products that we are actually developing and actually taste the products that we have currently that we want to ensure the consistency of the products. So for me, it's a matter of not just the existing products, but new product development. So my group is actually responsible for the new product development for Sazerac. And so when like we were tasting some rum just a minute ago, is basically to develop a new premium rum for the brand that we just bought, Myers Original Rum, Myers Rum. So that's how my day starts. It starts pretty early, around 6:30 in the morning.
Wow.
And all I do is taste samples for single barrels and different products like that. And then throughout the day, we look at different things. So that includes different products like maybe Canadian whiskey, maybe it includes a cognac from our distillery in France, or maybe it includes, like today, some contenders for our antique collection, which we look at all the barrel samples before we formulate a formula. And and then sometimes we get involved with consistency as far as making sure everything is consistent. So depending on what time of day and what's happening and time of year, it really depends on that. And plus, since I have a large group, we also develop products. One of our most famous products, which may not be very popular in South Africa, is Fireball, which we're responsible for.
Okay.
And we also do Southern Comfort, and in the U.S. we have hundreds of different products that have different flavors, so we also do that. So that's my responsibility at Sazerac, is all those different products too.
Brilliant, thank you. I mean, so that's an extensive portfolio covering, I mean, what sounds like just dozens of whiskeys, in addition to then not just whiskeys, but other alcohols as well. I mean, how good is your memory of taste and of, kind of the flavor profiles? Because, I mean, with that much kind of going around in your head, it must be quite a challenge.
Yeah, so I've been doing it for now 40 years, so it's something that's hard to get out of my head. It's just natural, and it never started like this at Buffalo Trace or Sazerac. It started off very slow, and I've grown into it. So that really you really absorb it a lot more. If you were to just walk into this position with all these products, it would be very difficult for anybody.
Right.
But I think it's because of my background, and also I grew into these products as we acquired different products over the years. That I think it's pretty easy for myself, anyways.
Okay, that's very impressive. So just setting aside the Buffalo Trace Distillery for a second, because I think we'll obviously focus on that a lot for today. There are other distilleries in the Sazerac portfolio. How often are you involved in the same capacity across all of them? And is there a lot of kind of, since you're the master blender, is there a lot of blending that happens between distilleries?
And actually, the answer to the last part is no. There's not really a lot of interconnectivity. The only thing that's common is that I get involved with the other distilleries. So, okay. For instance, our Montreal distillery has a master distiller, and we converse a lot about what to distill for Canadian whiskey, and I do the appraisals with their quality people, so I get involved with them. And the same with a cognac distillery in France, for instance. They actually have someone blending, or a cellar master, but I get involved in opinions and input through that process. Whereas in our distillery in India, I haven't been involved a lot with, other than at the beginning, because we have a distiller and master blender there. So depending on the distillery is depends on my involvement. And so like a company that we bought called Last Drop Distillers, I get involved with a lot because they don't have the people to do that. So I get involved in consulting with them a lot.
Okay, excellent. So am I correct in saying that for the Sazerac company, at least in the North American operations, you are the only master blender, whereas there are multiple master distillers?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, the blenders are hard to get. Companies, the master blender and the distiller are the same person, right? And smaller companies.
Yes.
But like our Tennessee whiskey distillery that's operating right now has a master distiller and assistant distiller, which / blender because they're small. But I still get involved and we consult all the time on their products. Okay.
So, I mean, where does the handoff start? Is it the master distillers are responsible for creating, obviously, the new make, unaged white spirit, and then putting into a cask, and then the rest of the process is all you?
Yeah, it's very close. The distiller will distill and put them in casks, and in the Buffalo Trace, they actually are responsible for the maturation process. And then as it's maturing, we assess the quality of the products and where they go, because we have so many warehouses here at Buffalo Trace. It's important to know where it's aging and because it gives you different taste profiles. So it's kind of like a handoff in between there, and then I'm ensuring at the end that the taste profile matches the standard, for instance.
Okay, understood. So, and this is going to be maybe a silly question, but so Sazerac company has multiple master distillers and only one single master blender, which is yourself, responsible for dozens of products. Why are you not as famous as the rest of the master distillers?
That's just the way it goes when you make bourbon. When you make bourbon, it's all about the master distiller because they're the ones who make the product. Nobody ever talks about the master blender. Whereas if you were to go to another country like, Scotland or Canada, there's much more talk about the master blender. So it's quite different. And here you take a little bit of a back seat, even though you're very important too, as far as what you contribute. So that's all right with me. I have enough work to do for all of it.
All right. Well, I'm going to start a movement to make the master blenders more well known. I think for obvious reason, and even just Googling around and trying to do a bit of research before we chatted today, it was there's a lot more information out there on the master distillers and less on you, and I think that's an injustice and a disservice. So I shall be formally lodging my complaint to Mark Brown of Sazerac on your behalf.
Uh-oh. Yeah, well, I think it's pretty important too, but depending on the product, that's what takes, whether it's distiller or blender.
Right. All right. So then moving on to Buffalo Trace. I mean, I think that's where most of your time is spent. I was wondering if you could maybe just give us a high-level rundown of the distillery and what kind of distillation occurs, how much warehousing is on site, etc. I know myself and most of the South African enthusiasts won't have been there, not yet. We all hope we can visit one day. But in lieu of visiting, if you could just give us maybe a high-level oversight of the distillery.
Sure, I can do that. Well, we've been, I think you said in your intro, I caught the end, distilling continuously since 1770s. So we're a very historic distillery, actually a National Historic Landmark in the U.S., and we're an actual operating National Historic Landmark, which means we're not only historic, but we're operating at the same time. And so we've been distilling a long time through floods, through Prohibition, and now through COVID-19, we've been operating. So I have my mask here that I have to wear when I leave my office. Okay. So we've been operating, making actually bourbon, but at the same time, we've been making hand sanitizer for the U.S.
Brilliant.
Yeah, so we're the most award-winning distillery in the whole wide world. Nobody even comes a close second, and we're very proud of that fact, but it takes a team of people. So right now, there's probably over 450 people at the distillery, which is quite a few, but we still hand bottle a lot of things. So we want to make sure we have the best quality. But here it's very simple process. Bourbon has to be at least 51% corn. So when we make our recipes, it's at least 51% corn. And then we have two bourbons. One is a rye bourbon and one is a wheat bourbon. And the rye bourbon is the rye grain is the second grain if it's a rye bourbon, and wheat is the second grain if it's a wheated bourbon. So a Weller or a Pappy Van Winkle does not have rye in it. Its second grain or small grain is wheat. And we distill that no higher than 160 proof and age it in a new charred oak container. And one thing about bourbon is there's no colors or flavoring allowed in the product. So when we cook our grain, we have a traditional cooking process. So the corn is actually cooked separately, and corn, remember, is over half of the amount of grain in the actual recipe. And that's cooked in a high-pressure vessel, and that basically gives you the corn that's cooked. And then we have the rye and the barley malt, or wheat if it's a wheated bourbon, cooked separately. And the reason we cook them separately is because we don't want to destroy the flavors of the small grains, the rye and the wheat. We want to encourage the flavor. And this takes a lot more time and effort, but it's worth it because of the quality that you get in the product. So after we mix the corn and the rye and the barley malt, we call that a sweet mash. And from there, we add that to the fermenter, and we add a previously distilled mash into that same fermenter, and we call that a sour mash. So all the remnants from the bottom of the still, a portion goes into the next fermenter to ensure consistency from lot to lot. And that sour mash process is very common in the bourbon industry. It also is very acidic, so it prevents bacterial contamination. So there's a lot of good things about it. But that souring mash is something that I think every bourbon distillery does. Okay. And then we add our yeast, our proprietary yeast, and after 3 to 5 days, we have around 7 to 8% alcohol. And we don't push the yield like maybe some other places because we really believe in the taste of the product. So if you push it too high and get too much alcohol, you're sacrificing some of the flavors that we're looking for.
Right.
So
right.
We're not all about efficiency, although we do like efficiency. We're more about the taste of the product or the taste profile. And so from that, after 3 to 5 days after fermenting, we sell it to we send it to our distillery, and we distill in a column still. It's around 3 to 4 stories tall. And everybody that has heard or seen a column still has seen the series of plates from top to bottom. And basically, as the mash comes in the top, steam is introduced to the bottom of the still. And as the steam goes up, it strips all the mash of its alcohol and all its congeners. And then all that mash falls to the bottom, and all the distillate that vaporizes all the good parts that we want. It's vaporized, and it goes to the top, and where it's condensed out at 120 proof. And that's our primary distillation methodology, which is, I think, pretty common around the world. If you go to Ireland, you'll see a Jameson distillery. They have a big column still that goes up to the clouds. A very similar process. And then in bourbon country here, we distill it the second time. So there's a double distillation, and we call that distillation a doubler, that distilling vessel. And basically, it's like a pot still. And that's where we redistill it, and it goes up. We try to reach about 135 proof. And that still has a lot of copper in it to get rid of some of the sulfurous type compounds. And so then from the distillation process, it's 135 proof, but for bourbon, a rye bourbon, we put in at 125 proof. By law, it cannot be entered into the barrel more than that. And again, proof is just, if you take half of it, that is your percent ABV.
Right, thank you.
Just for people who don't know. And so after we take it down from 135 proof to 125 proof by law, for bourbon, we let it age, and And then when we actually do our wheated bourbon, we happen to do it, we actually take it down to 114 proof, which is lower. So it's going to age a little bit slower, but more gracefully. So those are pretty big differences between the two styles of bourbons.
Excellent. So thank you. That's very, very insightful. Thank you for that. I'm curious to know, so as a distillery that produces multiple styles and multiple products, how does that that production process vary between the different, I guess spirits are intended for different releases? Is it just around the mash bill and the casks, and maybe, as you said, the casking proof? Or are there differences in the fermentation? Are there differences in the distillation of, a rye whiskey or a bourbon whiskey or a wheated bourbon, et cetera, et cetera?
Most of ours is not a difference in the process up front, like the distillation or fermentation, except, of course, our experiments, because we do a lot of experiments. But we want to maintain the consistency of these different products. So that part of the process isn't much different. What's different, though, is where we, the barrels, like you say, the casks, and where we age them in our distillery, because we have a lot of multiple locations. So I'll give you a good example is Blanton's is aged in Warehouse H. And Warehouse H is a metal-clad warehouse. So there's no bricks on this warehouse. And that... basically, during the day, it gets really hot because it transfers really quickly into the warehouse. And then at night, when it cools down, it cools quickly. So it's really driving that whiskey in and out of the wood quite dramatically, as compared to, say, a brick warehouse where it's much more subtle changes. So each one of our warehouses, because we have many different styles and types, gives us a different taste profile. As another example, an open warehouse, the top is really hot, the top of the warehouse, as opposed to the bottom, which is really cool. So if we were going to age something like a Pappy Van Winkle or Antique Collection, we wouldn't want to age it at the top because it would mature way too fast, much too oaky. So it's always in the middle to lower floors where it's cooler that we would age those products. So that's a lot of where our tastes come from. Is those methods versus the previous ones that you mentioned.
Right. I mean, I think it's absolutely fascinating because, if you're aware of the Scottish, warehouses, the Irish warehouses, obviously, we know that the location of the warehouse has some kind of impact, but I mean, the extent to which that has an impact is much less in those countries. Where, as in the US, in Kentucky, at the Buffalo Trace Distillery, the location across multiple warehouses, and then even within one warehouse, as you said, altitude or where it is in a particular side, will have such a big impact on flavor. That is just unbelievable.
If you look at it from a single barrel perspective, you can see that there are so many differences because we have an extensive single barrel program here for a lot of different products. And from barrel to barrel, you'll see all the variances. And there's quite a few, but as you change warehouses, it's even more. So it gives you an idea of the concept that variation does happen all the time, whether it's the wood or the actual location. Because as an example, when we do our antique collection, I pick from different locations of the distillery and different warehouses and different floors. And we actually state that in the letter that we give out. And that really adds to the complexity and the depth of the product that I'm trying to blend or trying to put together. So it's really quite a variable that's really not given a lot of attention to, but here we've really perfected it, I think.
And in terms of, I mean, how, I guess, is it just time and experience that enables a person such as yourself to know and have a kind of intuitive understanding of, which warehouse, where within that warehouse, what type of flavors will develop over time?
Unfortunately, the only way is through experience. Although we're putting together a catalog of different locations on where products should be put, and our warehouse people have intuitive and experience too where they place, because when we put a recipe away like a rye bourbon, we're not just putting it in one location all the time. We split it up and put it in multiple locations depending on the product mix. So in other words, if we want something that's older, we're not going to put all of them at the top. We're going to actually move them down to lower locations in different warehouses. So a lot of that comes with experience. I don't know any other way to do it, actually. But we're trying to a lot more and experimenting a lot.
Well, Drew, sorry, we were losing you. We were losing you there. You'll just repeat that?
We are trying to figure out why things react the way they do through various experiments in our organization. So, we know where things will taste good for certain products already, but why they taste good and where they're located is an unknown, and that's one of the reasons we're doing so many experiments, because our objective as a company is to find the best tasting whiskeys. It's like a project that will never end because you can always make better products. And so what we really believe in is we can make better whiskeys. And I'll give you an example if you don't mind.
Please.
Back in 2008, Jim Murray and the Whiskey Bible named the best whiskey is our E.H. Taylor 4 grain.
Right. Whiskey?
It's a 4-grain whiskey, so it's got corn. It's a bourbon, majority corn, rye, wheat, and barley malt. So all the grains put together. And the best part of this is that this bottle, this product that was in this bottle is an experiment, and it turned out to be the best whiskey in the world according to Jim Murray. So that's a good example of trying to make better whiskeys and experimenting with our products, and it happened to turn out to be the best whiskey. Now, this is a very successful example, but we've had many in the past that never even made it close to that. So we fail an awful lot on some of our experiments. As a matter of fact, we even have to dump some of them because they're so bad. So I think that's that trial and error process is trying to make a better whiskey. And to be honest with you, that's one of the fun parts of my job, is trying new things and trying to develop new and better products.
Wow, that's quite incredible. And I'm very keen to also just in a few minutes maybe speak about some of the experimentations that at least in the public eye, Buffalo Trace do. So, but just before we go on to that, I'm due to pour myself another dram. So you were mentioning single barrels, you were mentioning Blanton. I'm just going to open this up quickly. As I said, and I don't know if you caught that, but this is without doubt my favorite drinking standard release bourbon. It is absolutely brilliant. And so, as the master blender, I mean, you are still involved in even the single barrel releases. So just talk us through, your role in a single barrel release.
Yeah, so my role and my group's role, because I have a team of people here. We have 9 people here that do all the development for Buffalo Trace and Sazerac. So when we have a single barrel, if you come and visit us, we have a table. Actually, we have 4 tables, round tables that we actually rotate. And we have all our single barrel samples on there that we look at every single day. So in other words, every single barrel is assessed by my group and myself. So in other words, each of those single barrels is a separate lot. In other words, that's a batch. So we have to assess that. And before it becomes a single barrel, we approve it. So our taste panel approves it. We have to have at least 5 people that approve it as being a correct single barrel, because the rationale is one person can approve them all. Like when I first came here, there wasn't as many. But because we're all biased sensory-wise and not as proficient in some tastes and smells, if you have a taste panel, that really ensures a much better chance of not missing something, because some people are more sensitive to things than others. A good example is TCA, which is cork taint. Some people are much more sensitive than others. So that's the reason behind our panel. But for our single barrel, Our taste panel looks at every single barrel because that represents a single lot.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you for that.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you for that.
So, then I like specifically. So, I mean, we've been very fortunate in South Africa to have been receiving allocation of the Blanton's Gold. I know now in recent news, it's actually this was a product that wasn't generally available in the US and is now being made available to the US. Does that mean that South Africa is potentially going to lose some of its allocation?
Well, I don't get involved with allocations. Everybody asks me those questions, but one thing I do know is we're making more and more every year, so more becomes available. As a matter of fact, to be honest with you, every year I've been here at Buffalo Trace, this is 16 years now, every year we've made more and more and more, but it's never enough. So it's kind of one of those things that you can't make enough ever. But I promise you, we're investing over $1 billion over the next few years. Wow. And we're building more capacity as a distillery, but it just never seems to be enough ever since I started here 16 years ago.
That's I mean, the saying you can never get enough of a good thing, right? So definitely applicable in this case, and it's testament to you and the team at the distillery. I suppose, I mean, on that, in terms of some numbers, and I appreciate you might not be able to disclose everything, but how many single barrels would be released in a given year, of Blantons, and further to that, how many warehouses, how many casks approximately is Buffalo Trace sitting on in their warehouses?
Yeah, unfortunately, normally we don't talk about how much we release of anything. And we used to have a camera in Blanton's, and everybody used to watch when we made the antique collection how many cases we were making. They would be upset if they didn't get a bottle because there's not much made. So we don't talk about numbers, unfortunately. But we do have upwards of 1 million barrels at Buffalo Trace aging.
Okay.
Yeah, and Gary said $1 billion. Yes, over $1 billion we're investing. Yes. So we've already started the process. We have about 6 new warehouses, and these are 60,000 barrel warehouses. See, these are the largest in Kentucky, and we're basically building one every about 4 to 5 months.
Wow.
And so that's just an example. And as if you come to the distillery right now, you would see they're making room to add another still because of the investment that we're going to be producing. And I think not only do our products taste, I think, very good, but at the same time, our price points for our products are very good too. Now I'm not talking about the secondary market. I'm talking about what we ask our customers to pay for is very reasonable. So we want everybody to taste very good whiskey at a reasonable price. Although we can't stop people from charging on the secondary market, we don't condone that, but there's a lot of that going on.
Right, and I think, in terms of the South African price points for the Buffalo Trace portfolio that we get here, that is transferred here as well. So, the Buffalo Trace, the Sazerac rye, they're well priced. The Blanton's Gold, the Eagle Rare, for the quality of whiskey they offer, they are still incredibly well priced. As the retailer, I'm always fearful that in time their price is going to tick up because the quality of the whiskey is so good.
Well, that's one reason, to be honest with you, I love working here. And that's because when I first started, the age profile of Buffalo Trace is the same as when I started. And Buffalo Trace being the brand that's going to grow all over the world, you could easily get greedy and take the age down, because I used to do that with the previous companies that I worked with, because I've been doing this for 40 years. But you could easily lower the age over time and nobody would really know. But we haven't here. We've kept the age the same because we want to provide the taste quality of that product. And you would save a ton of money because you would need less warehouses, you would need less barrels, you would save a ton of money. So that just shows you the whole purpose of what we want to do is make a great product. And that's one of the reasons I love working here.
Yeah, well, oh, brilliant. And I mean, to you and the whole team as consumers of your products, and I know I speak on behalf of many South African whiskey drinkers. It's the proof is in the pudding, and we really appreciate it, because good whiskey at a good price these days is getting hard to come by. Some of the recent trends in Scotland are prices ticking up, but age is ticking down because the demand is so high and the supply takes time to kick in.
Yeah, but see, one thing, we have a different, we're privately held, so our philosophy is much different than the public company. Our philosophy is to build brands, because the game is the long-term game. We don't want to have short-term, everybody would want more profits right now, but the long-term game is what we're really about.
That's brilliant. So, I mean, just on that, you mentioned the initial asking price, retail price for some of these very high-end bourbons, limited release, the antique collections, the Pappies. The retail price, if you're one of the fortunate few, which is near impossible, is very, is almost cheap, so to speak. The secondary prices on those are, exorbitant and eye-watering. How does it feel as someone involved in making those products when you see some of these bottles on auction houses, fetching thousands of dollars?
Well, it's kind of flattering in some ways, but in another way, it's not getting to the people we want it to get to. In other words, we want everybody to enjoy our products, and when they charge so much for them, it's more difficult for them. And I think long term, we want everybody to enjoy our products.
Right. So you've mentioned, you've had quite an extended tenure in the drinks and in the whiskey industry. In terms of production, in the last 40 years, have there been any kind of real advancements or changes to production? Let's just say at Buffalo Trace and in general, in the production side of American whiskey making.
Yeah, I think the biggest, a lot of things are similar. It was 40 years ago, because I started out in the distillery, in the laboratory in the distillery, and very similar to today. It's just updates of equipment and the computerization to make the process, I think, a little more consistent. Because before it was more manual and subject to, depends on the person. And today it's more computer controlled from an office. So the product is much more consistent. So I would say that's the biggest change.
Okay. Interesting. So I'm keen just to, I really want to discuss the kind of the experimentation that Buffalo Trace is renowned for, and that you kind of alluded to earlier. But just before we do that, I know, when you start getting into American whiskey and specifically bourbon and rye, you get to understand the requirements, the 51% corn in the mash bill and the maturation periods. I'd love to just hear a few thoughts on casks, because I think often, and I was at fault here too, is that the understanding was, new oak, charred, American oak. But that, as far as I know, is not actually a technical requirement, right? It doesn't have to be American oak, and the size isn't specified. So is there room there to experiment and do, let's say, Buffalo Trace, play around with different varieties of oak and different size casks?
Well, that's a brilliant question, because we just introduced a new product called Charter Oak. And Charter Oak, you probably won't see over there, but we actually have released, I think, 3 now, different expressions. But basically it is oaks from oak trees, made from oak trees, the barrels from around the world. So the first one was, I forget what it was already. But anyways, it was, we did Chinquapin oak, we've done French oak, I think it was Mongolian oak. So we're doing all this series of releases under the Charter Oak expression of different oaks, and you'd be amazed the differences in taste. So for people who want to see the difference between the type of oaks around the world, that's the brand to get some. It's just very difficult to obtain.
Okay. That's very interesting. And then just lastly, coming back to one of the steps in the production that you mentioned, and I just for the sake of reiterating and I guess ensuring that this hits home with individuals, is the sour mash process, because there is a particular brand a worldwide famous American brand of whiskey that is very much kind of a sour mash. You know, it uses that almost as a selling point. Whereas, as you mentioned, you know, there's practically no American producer that doesn't use a sour mash process. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's my understanding. I don't go to these places all the time, but it's my experience has been everybody uses it. Probably not much in terms of the smaller distilleries, you know, that are very small. They wouldn't have access to that, at least not much. So, you know, if you look at it, maybe it's more of a marketing point, but it does provide consistency from batch to batch, and it helps with the bacteria contamination, like I mentioned.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. All right, so then moving on slightly to kind of this experimentation. Buffalo Trace is very much known for its experimentation, and I know it's a big part of your kind of portfolio as well. So I'd love you to kind of talk us through a bit around the Single Oak project, and then the famous Warehouse X.
Yeah, the Single Oak project started way before I arrived here. We basically took 96 different trees and cut them in half into two parts. We wanted to see if the top was better than the bottom, but at the same time we varied some other variables. The seasoning of the staves, the growth rings. Some have tight rings per inch, in other words, slower growth versus the faster growth, to see how that affects the tastes. Different recipes we use, different warehouses, different entry proofs, and actually different charring to see what made better whiskeys. So over many years, we've released those and under the Single Oak project and numbered the barrels, and some obviously better than others. And what we did is the one that everybody liked the most, we basically took that formula and we're actually making a product called the Single Oak. So eventually when that's ready to sell, that's what we're going to do. So in other words, it's trying to make the best whiskey we can again by this experiment. And what we found out, though, is, and we actually had some writers come, some world famous writers, and they looked at some of these variables, because we can control everything being the same except one variable, and it will show you what the difference is between within that variable. So for instance, when you have a tight grain, in other words, the rings are really tight, it doesn't allow the whiskey in very far, and it doesn't age as fast, so it's kind of immature. Whereas the ones that are really coarse, like the coarse grain that grew fast, allows the whiskey in much easier into that stave. And then actually you get a lot more wood interaction immediately. So it really could show you the difference between the two because you held the other variables constant, which really was an eye-opening experience for a lot of the writers that came from around the world. And so what we found is what the average was, and that's usually what a barrel is the average of those two, is a very great product around the age profile we're looking for. So that's why what we make now is good, but it shows you can change the variable and get different products. So as a result of that experiment, what that tells us is that, wow, this makes the best whiskey for that age. But then we ask ourselves many other questions like, well, what happens if you let them age longer? What would happen? So maybe the tight grain that was kind of immature, maybe after 30 years it would be the best whiskey. So it's very typical of all our experiments is that sometimes we ask more questions after the experiment is over than we did before because we've learned some things.
Right. That's absolutely brilliant. So just to be clear, has the Single Oak project kind of come to an end? I mean, you mentioned a finite number of trees. Has all that whiskey kind of filtered out and been matured and released, so to speak, and the lessons learned?
Yes, and we are actually aging what the audience thought was the best whiskey of all those, and that will be a separate new product come out when it's ready.
All right. So that's absolutely brilliant, and I think for me, you know, you always hear about. I think it very much kind of highlights a particular almost misconception in that, the small craft distilleries are the ones that are experimenting and that we need to watch out for and be careful for because they're disrupting the industry. But then you have Buffalo Trace Distillery, a very large producer, one of the largest, being probably more experimental than any other craft distilleries to some degree combined.
Yeah, well, that's our culture here. I've always said we've had a distillery within a distillery because we do all that at the same time. And we've taken it to the next level because you can never do things the same way. You always have to take it to the next level. And our philosophy here is to continue to take it to the next level. So we keep trying to be better and better every day. As a matter of fact, now we have our meetings with experiments. We have it twice a year, and the president of the company, which is Mark, which you know, he actually he doesn't chair it, but he's at that every single meeting because it's that important to the future of the company. But now it's not just Buffalo Trace. We have our other distilleries from around the world at this meeting, and we're all sharing ideas on how to make better products. So it's taken it to the next level. Like I said, it's brilliant.
Well, that's utmost respect and kind of admiration. I mean, that is just wonderful. Then on the same vein, Warehouse X. It sounds like a superhero character. But so if you could tell us a little bit about Warehouse X, and I know there's still lots kind of ongoing. That's a fairly newer experiment.
Yeah. So for centuries, everybody's been putting barrels in warehouses and expecting the best results, which maybe that is the best result. But we want to look at it differently. We want to look at everything basically in the process. And warehousing, you can't assume that we make it the best way now because we always want to make better whiskeys. So what we did is we built a warehouse, a little mini warehouse that'll never make product to taste or to drink other than through experimentation. And what we have is this warehouse cost over $1 million just to experiment, to have fun with. And we have actually 4 chambers in it and a breezeway. So the 4 chambers and the breezeway has about 30 barrels max that you can put in it. And we can control all the variables of that warehouse to see what makes the best whiskey. So every 2 years, we're experimenting with different variables to see what makes better whiskey. So the first experiment we did was natural light or UV. We wanted to see if that made a difference. We're working on temperature now. We're going to look at humidity and how that affects it because we can control each variable in these little chambers. And then another one is the airflow. So we have all these variables we're trying to learn from to see what makes the best whiskeys. And my boss Mark always kids that maybe the best way to make whiskey is have the barrels lying in a field and have someone with a shotgun guarding them. And we wouldn't have to build that warehouse. You just never know what makes the best whiskey. We know we can make good whiskey now, but can we make better whiskey? That's the whole purpose of this experiment. It's a 20-year experiment.
Okay. But I mean, it also raises a point though, because and I think for the sake of the audience, you refer to the best whiskey, but that obviously is subjective depending on your palate and what you like. So I think, when you're talking about best whiskey, it's probably best whiskeys, the best, in terms of their style and their category, trying to, just kind of refine them to as far as you can take it. Yeah.
I find it's like the Holy Grail. You'll never get there. So we can make the best whiskey for certain people and the other people might not like it as much. So the thing is, we'll never get there. That's the point you're trying to make. And I agree with that, is that we're trying to make a better product or products, but we'll never get there. We'll always be trying to improve, and that's our philosophy. So we don't want to get stuck on we're making great products, just leave it go. Right. The thinking here is not to do that. We're making great products, great, but tomorrow someone will want something different. So we just introduced a new product here. And you probably haven't even seen this one yet, but this is another E.H. Taylor. Okay. It's the 18-year-old marriage of different whiskeys. So here's a blending or marrying exercise after it's aged of 18-year-old product, which is a fabulous product. I just wish everybody could taste some.
I wish so too. I just I'd love to know, and if you're happy to, we'll go into some questions from the audience. I see lots of questions, which is wonderful. But just before we do that, when it comes to Scotch whiskey, the general, I guess one of the mantras is that 60 to 70% of the flavor of the whiskey comes from the cask, comes from the barrel. I'd love to hear your, and I know it's just it's just an estimate, but in terms of your typical bourbon or rye on the shelf, how much of the flavor comes from the mash bill, on average, and how much flavor comes from, let's say, the cask and or the warehouse?
Yeah, there's a lot of similarity with Scotch, but the barrel's more predominant because the Scotch industry uses used barrels. So the impact of the wood here is quite great. But also, when I do a lot of tasting or training and tasting, I talk a lot about the recipe because that really dictates up front what your product will taste like. So in other words, when you're tasting a wheated bourbon, the wheat really is a soft grain after you age it. In other words, it's going to give you a palatable creaminess that you don't get maybe as much with a rye bourbon. So I always talk about the impact of the recipe and the taste profile. So even if you taste the 4-grain that I showed earlier, that has the 4 grains, so it's kind of a blend of all those attributes, which I think makes it a great whiskey. So I would say the recipe is very important too, but predominantly with the aging process, the barrel, because it is new, is probably more so than the recipe. And then the fine tuning comes with the aging. So that, you're right, those 3 things are important, but I can differentiate products based on where it's aging, even if it's the same mash bill, and that's what we do here at Buffalo Trace. So a Buffalo Trace is the same recipe as Eagle Rare, but when you taste the 2, it's like entirely different. And that's because of not just the location, but the barrel and the extra years of aging. So it's always a mix of those, and probably varies somewhat depending on the product.
Okay, so just I mean, from a and I guess it's a short answer here, but from an operations perspective, how does a distillery go about tracking all these variations? The mash bill, the casks, the grain, if you know what it is, where it is in the warehouse, when it should be adjusted. And it seems almost like an impossible feat because in terms of information and data, how do you go about just managing all of that?
We have our own program that we actually watch all those variables, and it's proprietary to us. So we have our own system. Nobody else has it.
Okay, great. So nice, easy answer there.
Yeah, but I think a lot of people, they like to rotate barrels. We don't. We like to keep them where they are. The reason they like to rotate barrels is because they have one product and they want it consistent. We have multitude of 50 products, and we want the locations to be all different because that's how you differentiate the 2.
Okay, so in terms of, I mean, since you've raised it, and it is something that is quite well known for American whiskey producers, this rotation of the barrel, and you always hear the other side that Scotland, Ireland, no need to do it. I mean, my understanding is partly because the area of the barrel that no longer has spirit in contact with it is potentially at risk of drying and cracking. Is that a fallacy?
Well, we don't really worry about that too much, even though we have people looking for leakers. We have a lot of old products too. I guess it depends on the climate or where you are in the world. I remember and especially if you reuse barrels, it becomes depleted over time. So ours are all brand new, so it's not such a big issue here.
Okay, brilliant. On that, I'd very much like to then just a few questions from the audience, and our first question is on this topic, and this is from Duncan. And Duncan, his question is: people always ask where the Scottish distilleries get their bourbon casks from. Duncan would like to know, where does Buffalo Trace get its wood from? Do you have your own, I guess, plantations or forestry areas, or is it sourced somewhere else within the U.S.?
Yeah, we have several suppliers for our barrels, but they all source oak from, the Midwest at some point. So it's quite a big area. As a matter of fact, we always worry about running out of wood someday. So It's a very important thing. So it's all it's not too far from where we're located, or most of the distilleries in the U.S. 95% of the whiskeys and bourbons come from here where we are. So it can't be too far from here. We do a lot of experiments with different wood, which we import. So, but we have a couple suppliers. Yes.
Okay, so I mean, and that's a good point you raise it, because in the last decade we've seen an absolute explosion of distilleries across the globe. You know, from obviously America with all the micro distilleries to the new Canadian distilleries opening up, to Ireland, Scotland, even Japan. They're all using American oak generally, you know, through some guys. I mean, you know, is there a legitimate concern as an American producer that one day you're going to have to be vying against a Japanese producer for a cask?
Yeah, there always is that concern, and you know, there's lots of things you can do to prevent that. A lot of the oak usage goes to flooring and stuff, and a lot of that's changing now because people are using the composite type of flooring, so there's more availability of oak. But oak trees take at least 50, 60, 70 years to grow, so it does take some time. We don't have a problem right yet, but down the road there may be. But, you know, one good thing is all the barrels that go to Canada and Scotland, they're all used barrels, so they come from distilleries like ourselves.
Mm-hmm. All right, brilliant. Thank you for that. So that answers Duncan's question. We've got a question from Nigel, and the question is there a definitive guide to American whiskey? So I suppose, you know, for what recommendations or advice would you give to individuals looking to learn more about bourbon specifically? You know, in terms of resources and books and online places.
Yeah, I would just say online would be the place I would look. Probably not too much reading the distillery websites, because they'll tell you what they want you to know. Well, except for ours, of course. But online is probably the best source of information.
Okay. All right. I'd also, so to Nigel, I know there are two, you know, fairly well-known American bourbon writers I'm personally big fans of. I would throw in there Fred Minnick and Chuck Cowdery, both very well-known. They're quite active online, so, you know, maybe worth checking out there as well. The next question is from Gary, which is there a reason as to why the Eagle Rare 17 is always such small quantities? Is it down to barrel quality and quantity?
Well, it's up to me, because if I don't like barrels, I don't use them for that. So there's usually lesser of that than the others. Stag seems to have a plentiful supply compared to that, but over the years it's always been in smaller supply. But if there are some barrels that are not good, we won't use them. So it's really up to me how much gets out. So as a matter of fact, if I didn't like any, there wouldn't be any Eagle Rare this year if we didn't like them.
Right. Wow. That's quite a position of responsibility. That's a good and bad thing, because we'd like more Eagle Rare, but we appreciate the level of quality.
I have no problem saying no to anything, because I would be supported by the boss. So I don't even worry about it.
But I mean, and you're in a unique position, because, you know, it's obviously about quality first and foremost, not just about commercial drivers and the you know, the profits selling these bottles. So I mean, you know, a lot of distilleries and you know, I'm a passionate whiskey guy. You know, we've got a big passionate whiskey audience and enthusiasts in South Africa. But, you know, too often people are releasing something that maybe shouldn't be released just yet, but they're doing it for the money. Is that a no comment?
No, you just broke up a little bit. Sorry.
Okay, no problem. So next question, if you can hear me, Drew, is you mentioned a distillery in India. Are you making whiskey or rum at this distillery? And that's from Valentine.
Yeah, they make whiskey, but their definition of whiskey is different than the U.S. definition. So, I think in India you can make whiskey from rum and stuff. So I think it's a little bit different. It's not our traditional definition of whiskey, but we do make single malts.
Indian single malts.
And, you know,
Indian single malts.
And in India, a lot of the top-selling brands in India are brands that have mostly neutral grain spirits and flavors at it.
Right. Okay. Got you. All right. I think that answers Valentine's question. So as opposed to kind of an Amrut or Paul John, not kind of authentic single malt as the rest of the world defines it, but more Indian style whiskey, which can use other ingredients. A question here from Gary saying, is Blanton's Gold going to get cut from South Africa now that it's being offered? So sorry, Drew, I asked you that. You said you're not involved in that, so that answers that question. Another question from Duncan. What are the chances of getting more exclusive releases annually, like the Antique Collection, Pappy, Single Barrel Blantons, etc.? So I guess in terms of, you are quite involved in new product development. Are we looking at more annual limited releases?
Yeah, well, well, first of all, I'm not in charge of the allocations, so that's important to know. But if you look at our releases, like the E.H. Taylor, we have a core set of products that we always have available, and then once a year or twice a year, we introduce something very limited. So I'm not sure where they would send those, but it's very few to begin with, so I'm sure it's hard to get in South Africa.
All right, fair enough. That answers that question. We have another question here from Duncan saying, what is your golf handicap? I'm guessing potentially there's some, online. You're a golfer. Yeah,
someone, I think must have been him, said if you drink rum, you must be a golfer. So my handicap is really high right now because I don't play very much.
All right.
So it's probably 105.
All right, fair enough. If you don't mind, we'll just take one or two more, and then we'll let you get on your day. We know you've got important things to do and amazing whiskey to release. This is a question from Gary. Drew, the warehouse that holds one barrel, what kind of process goes into selecting the barrel that gets put it there? So I'm guessing it's around, how do you decide if a particular style of barrel goes to a particular warehouse, if it's potentially something new you're working on, not a standard release that you kind of know what goes where?
Well, that barrel warehouse is a single barrel warehouse. It's just basically a distiller and myself. We pick the barrel that goes in it. And then after every million barrels, we take that barrel and bottle it. We bottle it for charity so that we give the money that we make off of it to charity. So it's really symbolic. But we take care in choosing the barrel and putting it in there and then actually bottling it.
All right, great. Thank you. So we'll make this the last question from Dale, just cognizant of your time. And this is, what do you think the impact on other countries will be now that Blanton's Gold will be going on sale in the States? Sorry, I'm reading these as I kind of asked them, so I appreciate you've already touched on this.
Yeah, and the Blanton's Gold that in the States will be limited, so it's not going to be that much.
Okay. So then
just think.
Sorry, go ahead.
We make all this Blantons that goes around the world, and they only were able to get one expression in the U.S. So everybody's really excited in the U.S. about having some gold available.
Right. I would say I'm excited for them, but I prefer having more Blanton's Gold for ourselves. But that's okay. I mean, it comes from the U.S. They have a right to be getting access to it. Buffalo Trace has as a distillery, has a bit of a history of changing names. I mean, at one stage, George T. Stagg, Old Fire Copper at times. What are the chances? And I'll be all for this if you'd like me to start a petition of getting your name in time on that distillery wall.
No. It's not about one person here. It's about the whole team. So it'll always be called Buffalo Trace, at least for the next 100 years. The whole group that makes up the team here.
Well, that's something a good leader and team player would say. So I mean, my hat off to you. What are the chances, though? At least we can see your name on a bowl of whiskey, since you are so integral to every release that Buffalo Trace does.
Maybe someday. I have my name on every bottle except it's not there. It's there in spirit. How's that?
Okay, fair enough. And then lastly, just before we let you go on your way, Drew. So I mean, am I correct in saying that you haven't been to South Africa yet?
Yeah, that's correct. That's one place that I have to go, at least once. Really, I was just talking to someone this morning. I have never been there, and I would love to come. If someone would ever invite me, I might go.
All right. Well, with that in mind, this is, I guess, as an official invite can be. You're absolutely invited. We would love to have you. We've got a wonderful growing community of bourbon, lovers and whiskey, well, American whiskey enthusiasts as well. And you can't be a bourbon enthusiast without loving Buffalo Trace. So please come sometime. We usually have a whiskey festival, but with the current global pandemic, that's been delayed. But we'd love to have you. Masterclasses, show floor, signing bottles. You're always invited. Please come.
Thank you. Thank you very much for today.
Yeah. So thank you for your time. I could speak to you for hours. We really appreciate it. We know you're busy. There's been some great feedback and questions. So thank you. And we hope to you and your family and the whole Buffalo Trace team keep safe, keep sane.
You guys too. Thanks.
Thank you, Drew. Okay, that brings us to the end of that. I don't know about everyone else, but I thought that was brilliant. I could speak to Drew for hours. I think there's so much detail around it. There's so much, obviously, there's very little. I don't think there's anything that he doesn't know about the process. And I guess as a whiskey enthusiast, we're much more, at least in South Africa, we're much more aware of what's going on in Scotland, and kind of the intricacies of Scotch production. But to have someone from the American industry on with such a history and responsible for so many great brands, absolutely brilliant to just pick his brain and get some of those questions answered. I'm going to wrap up shortly. I'm very, I know these are going for too long. I'm going to just quickly have a quick look through the questions. And I'm going to ignore that one from Gary. Anyone else with a question other than Gary? When can we expect a Buffalo Masterclass in South Africa from Hardy? Well, hopefully we can get Drew here sometime to the Only Whiskey show. Unlikely to be this year based on the current situation, but let's put Drew high on the list. Let's put him first on the list for next year. I think what from my point of view from WhiskyBrother, what we've absolutely seen in the last few years, and it literally is just the last few years, is this new kind of hunger and interest in American whiskeys, and specifically bourbon and rye. And I think also, the American whiskey industry has come a long way. It was part of what I would love to kind of speak to Drew about, having been involved for 40 years. But the American industry was quiet, and not much was happening 30, 40 years ago, at least as far as I know. Where if you look in the last several years, there's been just such an explosion as whiskey, as all types of whiskey have become more popular and have found new markets. Bourbon has been one of those types of whiskeys, and I think it's just, it's wonderful to see that locally we've got a lot more interest and enthusiasm into trying new bourbons, trying new ryes. Whereas before, and I remember this literally from 7 years ago when WhiskyBrother first opened, we weren't being asked about, E.H. Taylor or antique collections. We weren't being asked about, Four Roses or Michter's or Balcones. Whereas today, the biggest issue we have now is trying to get these whiskeys to, whiskey enthusiasts who are asking for them. But hopefully, as soon as things return to normal, or to some semblance of normality, and we can actually get going and do what we do, we'll absolutely continue to try and get as many interesting bourbon and ryes. And I think it's great that locally now there is a good Buffalo Trace, agent and importer. Last year we got a few antique collections. I know many will be disappointed that they didn't get an antique collection. But the truth is, it was the first time in almost 10 years that something had actually come to the country. So hopefully in time, keep drinking Buffalo Trace, keep drinking Sazerac, Eagle Rare, Blanton's, and hopefully as the volumes increase, that's usually then when the brands will say, okay, cool, well, let's bring in E.H. Taylor. Let's bring in a George T. Stagg Jr., or just a Stagg. So, it's wonderful to see kind of the growing enthusiasm for bourbon in South Africa. I'm going to go through some other questions just quite quickly. We've got a question from Morris. Morris is asking, when will we get Wee Beastie in South Africa? And the answer is, Morris, we don't know. At this point in time, We're just trying to get Black, the Ardbeg Day annual release, available. I mean, for the last 2 months, everything's been shut down. No alcohol is moving into the country or moving through the country, as you know, and that's very much put at least a 2-month delay on getting Wee Beastie here. My understanding is that when we had Brendan McCarran on and spoke to Rob Gray locally from Ardbeg and Glenmorangie, it is meant to come to South Africa. I would just venture, based on my experience in this industry, I don't think we'll get it this year. I really hope I get proven wrong, but everything takes longer than you expect. And at the moment, I don't think anybody with level 3 restrictions in place will even try and get whiskey to the country, because the truth is you don't know if it's going to clear the ports and what the backlog is, and then it's just a risk of of theft or damage. So Morris, sorry I can't be more specific than that, but Wee Beastie will get here. We just have a little bit of patience, drink some other Ardbeg in the meantime, and as soon as it's here, you'll know. I'm going to go quickly through the questions. We got a question from Don saying, "Hi Drew, and I appreciate Drew's not here. I hope I can answer the question. Can you tell us uninitiated more about Canadian whiskey? What makes it distinct from American whiskey in terms of new make, aging, casks, speaking in general terms?" Don, that's a very good question. I have some idea of Canadian whiskey. I'm personally a big fan. It's also been an industry that's been quite quiet and almost unrecognized in the last few decades. And then within the last few years, we've seen also new micro distillers, new craft distillers, and some larger players experimenting and doing cool things. I think that I will take it upon myself to try and do a live stream in future with a Canadian whiskey expert. We'll try and get Devin on. Devin is based in Canada. He wrote the Canadian whiskey book. We'll see if we can get him on and he can give a nice introduction to Canadian whiskey. I think that's a good idea. Sorry, I can't kind of follow that more information at the moment. All right, we're going to wrap it up there. I just want to say, so we will have shows next week and the following week. Next week, our guest of honor, our special guest, will be Gordon Bruce. Gordon Bruce is the master distiller at the Knockdhu Distillery in Speyside, Scotland. Knockdhu, obviously, Annock single malt, so more commonly known as Annock, sold as Annock. Gordon will be joining us from the distillery. He's absolutely brilliant. Actually, I saw him last year on one of my trips. Again, a beautiful distillery. We're big fans of the whiskey, and he's genuinely just a great person. And he's been in the distillery for a decade and a half, I think. So we've got Gordon on next week. We then, the following week, we also have another very special guest. I'm not going to just disclose that guest just yet. I'll maybe keep you in suspense for next week. And there's always a risk that maybe something changes. But for those 2 weeks, for the next 2 Fridays, we'll have our show. It will kick off at the same time. I think thereafter, we'll maybe take a week break and then come back in a new time slot, because hopefully by then, everyone's back in the office. And we know it's Friday. For lockdown, 4 p.m. was a good time. But as hopefully lockdown eases, and I know this is all up in the air, we'll look to move to a slightly later slot. I just want to say thank you to everybody as I'm wrapping up. Thanks for all the chats. Thanks for the comments. Thanks for tuning in and watching. We've had a great audience. I hope you enjoyed Drew Mayville as much as I did. Just, again, so much information, so much knowledge, and hopefully we can get into South Africa and get to meet him in person. But just going through the list of names in the chats and kind of just, thanks to Dale. Thank you to Michelle. Thank you to Hardy. Gary, obviously, part of the furniture. Thanks, Luch. Emil's back. We've got Neil. Just literally want to just say hi to a few people that I see here. Hi to everybody. Hi to Andrew, Reese, Morris again, Sebastian, Brad. Not everyone watching is commenting. So if you didn't comment and I didn't give you a specific name, just to say thank you anyway. We really appreciate the support. If anyone is interested, you're doing an online tasting and you want to see more of me, I know it's unlikely, or you want to see Val or Neil or Gary for an online event, check out that link that I put in that I put there earlier, or that's on the website. I'm going to just put it here again. And all proceeds will just help support the bar and make sure that when the time comes, we can reopen the bar. Otherwise, thank you for watching. Enjoy your whiskey. I'm about to pour myself maybe some of this. I should have showed Drew this, but some George T. Stagg. And keep safe, keep sane, and we'll see you next week. Thank you very much, everyone.